All right, tonight's Torah portion is the Torah portion of Teruma. Teruma is a very important and fundamental Torah portion that discusses the details, or rather in great detail, the instruction from the Almighty to the Jewish people to build the tabernacle. The tabernacle, otherwise known as the Mishkan in Hebrew, was the dwelling place for God, for the divine here in this world. It was a miniature traveling temple. It may have been world's first mobile home. It was a mobile home for the divine. And the details of which are in this week's Torah portion, following which next week is the details of the garments that the priests, including the high priest, would wear, as well as various furnishings that were in the temple. A home needs furnishings. A home for the divine had its own special furnishings. And so we're going to focus on actually the first few verses in this week's Torah portion. And before we get to that, there is a concern that some people have, and I meet those people often as a rabbi. We get those questions and those statements where I meet someone and say, start a conversation, and during the course of the conversation say, so tell me, are you Jewish? And they'll tell me, yeah, I'm a Jew, but I'm not a good Jew. And what they mean to say is that they're not practicing or not practicing as much as they think they should be, which may be the case. But really, there's no such thing as a bad Jew, because we're all inherently good. And we got to constantly step it up a notch, because any living thing, the sign that it's alive is that it's constantly growing. So too, as a Jew, we got to constantly grow. If we're not fulfilling all the 613 commandments, let's do today a little bit more than we did yesterday. And so when it comes to that idea of stepping it up a notch, where do I step it up? Let's say I want to become a better Jew today than I was yesterday. What should I do today? Should I study more Torah? Should I give more charity? Should I put on tefillin and wear it for a little bit longer and say some extra prayers? Should I eat more kosher? Should I, there's so many commandments. Where do I begin? Maybe I need to meditate more. Maybe I should go to the top of the mountain and focus on my love and fear of the Almighty. Where does one begin? And so tonight's class, we're going to focus on the first few verses of the Torah portion, which will give us a little bit of an insight into where one should begin. And in preparing this class and in studying this week's Torah portion, which speaks about really, and we're not going to dwell on that aspect too deeply, but it deals with the first fundraising campaign. Nowadays, we're quite familiar with it in a Jewish and organizational nonprofit perspective, and as well as a for-profit perspective, capital campaigns and whatnot. There were many of them, but this one may have been the first fundraising campaign for the local shul. Moses came to the Jewish people and said, God said that everyone should give. How much should they give? Give whatever you can give. And so it reminded me of the story where the rabbi comes to the synagogue after a terrible storm, a hurricane, and gathers an urgent meeting with his congregants and says, listen up, there's something I have to tell you. And this is what I'm going to tell you. What I'm going to tell you is that there's good news and there's bad news. So they looking perplexed at the rabbi, and he says, look, the bad news is, I messed up a little bit. Let's rewind. The rabbi says, look, we have an issue, a major issue during the current hurricane. There's been a terrible breach in our synagogue. The roof has caved in, and we need a new roof. And so there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is that we have the funds necessary to fix that roof and to restore our synagogue to its intended splendor. But the bad news is the money's in your pockets. And so that was the first fundraising campaign, and we're going to read about it in text 1 of this week's Torah portion for those of you who do have the books. By the way, if you can post in the chat box, did you purchase the books? I know it's available on Amazon. I put out the link. I'm just curious to know if anyone, it would be interesting to know purchased the student book. But either way, if you can let us know during the course of the class, either way, I'll pull it up on the screen. There we go. We got someone who has the book. So it's on page 89 of the student book, the beginning of this week's Torah portion, and that is the first verses that we begin reading from Parshat Teruma. Let's hope this works the first time. There we go. I think this is a miracle. The first time the screen share worked immediately. All right, here it goes. Exodus chapter 25, verse 1 through 9. God spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and have them take for me an offering. From every person whose heart inspires him to generosity, you shall take my offering. And this is the offering that you shall take from them: gold, silver, and copper, blue, purple, and crimson wool, linen and goat hair, ram skins dyed red, tachash skins, and acacia wood, oil for lighting, spices for the anointing oil and for the incense, shoham stones and filling stones for the ephod and for the choshen. The ephod and choshen were garments worn by the high priest. The choshen, more famously known by its English name, the breastplate. And they shall make me a sanctuary, and I will dwell in their midst. According to all that I show you, the pattern of the Mishkan and the pattern of all its vessels, and so shall you do." And so this is the first fundraising pitch of all times. There was a collection of these 13 materials, not more, not less, specifically these 13, because each one of these 13 were utilized in the temple in various aspects of this traveling temple, the tabernacle. The various wools were used for the tapestries that hung throughout the tabernacle. The various hides were used, and skins were used as coverings of the tabernacle. The gold, silver, and copper were used for the furnishings, the oil for lighting, spices for anointing oil, and so on and so forth. These were the 13 materials that were necessary, and Moses put it out there. Here's the call. No one has to give any specific amount, and it's not that you must give, but whoever would like to give shall come forward and give. And guess what? It may have been the first time, and may have even been the last time when there was a call for fundraising. And lo and behold, there was so much. The Jews were so generous, and they gave so much that Moses had to tell them, "Stop. We have more than enough. Keep it. We don't need any more. Stop bringing it in." Next time you get such a email from a nonprofit, let me know, where they say, "Stop. Don't give us any more. We got enough." And so they got more than enough. But as a matter of fact, it's not just arbitrarily chosen 13 items. These 13 items were very, very specific. As a matter of fact, each one of the 13 corresponds to something that has deep meaning and purpose and teaches us a specific lesson. Let's take a look at the Midrash on these verses. They give us some insight on the first 4 materials. The Midrash says as follows: "The gold used in the tabernacle corresponds to the kingdom of Babylonia, of which the verse states, 'You are the head of gold.'" The Midrash is explaining that the 4 first materials correspond to the 4 kingdoms that exiled the Jewish people. The first one, gold, corresponds to Babylonia. As it says in the verse in Daniel, "You are the head of gold." The vision that Daniel had, where he envisioned Babylonia as the head of this creature created out of various materials. Babylonia was the head of gold, being that it was the strongest empire, was the superpower of its time. And that's what the gold in the temple corresponded to. The silver corresponds to the kingdom of Media, Persia, as the verse states in the book of Esther, which we will be reading next week. "If it pleases the king, let it be written to destroy them, and I will weigh out 10,000 silver talents," a reference to the kingdom of Media and silver. The copper corresponds to the kingdom of Greece, as it was the least powerful of them all. It was a superpower. It was a nation that enslaved that exiled the Jews, but it was the least powerful of all, and therefore it's corresponding to the least important of these metals. And the red-dyed ram skins correspond to the kingdom of Edom, as the verse states, and the first one emerged reddish. A reference to a quote from the verse when Jacob and Esau were born, and Esau was the oldest one. He was the first one to emerge, and he emerged reddish, which is why they correspond to the red-dyed ram skins that were in the temple. The kingdom of Edom is included in the kingdom of Edom is the Roman Empire, who were the ones that exiled the Jewish people after the destruction of the Second Temple. And so these four kingdoms, Babylonia were the first ones to exile. It is not including the initial exile of the Jewish people, the Egyptian slavery. The reason for that being that the Jewish people weren't really a nation at the time. At the time that the Jews were in Egypt, they were still what you'd call a large family, very large family, but a family nonetheless. It was a ancestor, Jacob, who had many children, and those children were enslaved in Egypt. They only became the Jewish nation following Exodus and the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. And so the four nations that we are referencing here are the four nations that exiled the Jewish people following the giving of the Torah. The first one being the Babylonian Empire, roughly 850 years following Exodus. The Jewish people entered Israel, they conquered Israel, they lived there. 400 years later, they built the first temple, and 400 years after that, the Babylonian Empire entered Israel, destroyed it, destroyed the temple, and exiled the Jewish people to Babylon. A number of years after that, a short number of years after that, came the Medianite Empire, the Persian Empire, who conquered the Babylonian Empire and enslaved the Jewish people for about 70 years in Persia and Babylon. Following that, and during that time, during that era, was the story of Purim, Mordechai and Esther, roughly 372 BCE to 348 BCE. Following that is when King Darius II succeeded Ahasuerus as the ruler of Persia, and he instructed that the second temple be rebuilt. And later, Ezra led the Jewish people back to Israel. And although they were in Israel and they had the temple, they were still not under their own jurisdiction. They were under the jurisdiction of the Greek Empire, which was the third exile, that although they had the temple, it wasn't entirely theirs, and during which that period of time was the miracle of Hanukkah, following which the miracle of Hanukkah, the Hasmoneans then took control, autonomous control of Israel, and they then were in control until the end of the era of the Second Temple, which was roughly 69 of the Common Era, when the Roman Empire came and destroyed the temple, exiled the Jewish people, and that exile, the Roman exile, or as it's referred to here in the Midrash, the kingdom of Edom, the Edomite exile, within which we are still exiled today. And we await and pray for the coming of Mashiach every day. May he come speedily in our times. And so now that we know what these four kingdoms represent, and we explain that the Midrash says that they correspond to these first four materials in the temple correspond to these four kingdoms, begs the question, what's going on here? We're talking about building the temple. We're talking about building the tabernacle. The first time the Jewish people, they're autonomous, they're free, they left Egypt, they received the Torah at Mount Sinai, they're headed towards the promised land. They weren't given the decree of being in the desert for 40 years yet. So they're going to be in the promised land at any moment. And Moses tells them, gather these 13 specific materials. You're going to build this temple. But you know what? These four first items correspond to the four rulers that will destroy the temple, to the four rulers that will exile the Jewish people. How does that fit? Why on earth would that be the correspondence? Shouldn't it correspond to, I don't know, four of the great sages? Shouldn't it correspond to, granted that everything in the Torah is precise and has meaning and it's not just arbitrarily chosen, shouldn't it be something more positive? not the exact opposite of what we're attempting to accomplish over here? In the words of the Rebbe, it is baffling. What do the four kingdoms have to do with the donations for the tabernacle? Moreover, the four kingdoms precipitated the four exiles and the destruction of the temple, the very opposite of the donations which were intended to build the tabernacle. Why would the Midrash compare the Mishkan's construction to these tragic events signaling the temple's destruction? What's going on here? And so, as we do quite often, we're going to take a slight turn and attempt to understand what exactly is the purpose of the Mishkan. Why was it built? What's unique about it? And with understanding the idea of what the Mishkan is all about, we will then understand this perplexing idea. Chaim. So here's a quote from the beginning of this week's Torah portion. Our favorite commentary, Rashi, Shlomo Yitzchaki, the 12th century, 11th, 12th century French sage, analyzes the beginning verses of our Torah portion. And the astute students may have noticed that in the first few opening verses, it said the concept of teruma, of donation, contribution, 3 times. Here's Rashi highlighting those 3 times and explaining them. You shall take my offering. The word for offering is terumati. My offering, terumati. Says Rashi, our rabbis said the word teruma, offering, is mentioned 3 times in the opening verses, indicating that 3 offerings are mentioned here. One is the offering of a half shekel per head, from which they made the sockets. Another is the offering of a half shekel per head for the community coffers, from which to purchase the communal sacrifices. And another is the offering for the tabernacle, each individual's donation. The 13 materials mentioned in the section were all required for the work of the Mishkan or for the garments of the priests, as you will find when you study them closely. So Rashi analyzes that these and explains that these 3 mentions of the word offering, teruma, is not just referring to the collection of the temple. You see, at that time, there was the collection of the temple. The 13 materials associated with the building of the temple, with which our Torah portion in its entirety discusses all 13 materials. And then it hints at a subsequent 2 funding campaigns that are discussed in subsequent Torah portions. What are these 3 general funding campaigns? The first one was the raw materials, which is explained at length in this week's Torah portion. The 2 that it's hinting at, the first one was a collection of donations of a half shekel, not more, not less, per person in the desert. There was a collection of every single Jew to give a half shekel. What were those half shekels? They were silver coins. What were they used for? They were melted and formed into silver sockets as the foundation of the tabernacle. So the rest of the silver and the gold and the copper and the materials was used for the rest of the temple, for the tabernacle. But these silver coins were used specifically for the sockets, the foundation of the tabernacle. It's not in this week's Torah portion. It's just hinted at with the word teruma, a additional word teruma, one of the 3 times. What's the third Teruma that's hinting at the third funding campaign? There was another collection of half silver shekels, and that half silver shekel was actually an annual collection, and those went to the communal sacrifices. See, there are certain sacrifices throughout the year that are personal, others that are communal. The personal ones were if someone was celebrating a miraculous healing, any occasion to thank God, he'd want to bring a sacrifice. That was a personal one. If someone committed a sin, he had to bring a sacrifice. That's a personal sacrifice, having to come from the individual's own pockets. Then there were communal sacrifices that were brought daily, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. Sacrifices that were brought on Shabbos, sacrifices that were brought during the holidays, and so on and so forth. For that, there was a communal coffer, and that was funded with this half shekel, the annual half shekel for the communal offerings. So we have these three funding campaigns. The materials that was used for the temple, discussed at length in this week's Torah portion. The half shekels, that the silver of which was used for the sockets, the foundation of the Mishkan. And three, we have the half shekel that was used for communal sacrifices. Those were the three funding campaigns. Why these three? What was unique about these three? Why three and not four and not two? Why can you include the sockets in the materials? Specifically three. Where else do we have the number three in Judaism? Many places. But one unique place in the ethics of our fathers, that these three funding campaigns correspond to. Here's the quote from chapter 1, Mishnah 2 of the Ethics of the Fathers. Shimon the righteous was among the last surviving members of the Great Assembly. He would say, the world stands on three things, three pillars. Torah is one, the service of God is two, and kind deeds. The three collections correspond to these three things that the world stands upon, these three fundamental pillars. They reflect the three pillars of Torah, service, and deeds of kindness. How so? Torah is the basis for all Jewish life. Everything in our lives, what we do, what we study, how to behave, how to wake up, how to go to sleep, everything we do in business, everything we do in life, we follow the Torah. Torah is the instruction manual for life, which is why the Torah is represented by the Adanim, the sockets, the foundation of the tabernacle. It's the foundation, just as the Torah is the foundation, the sockets are the foundation. And so the Torah is represented by that funding campaign for the sockets, the half shekel, silver half shekels that went for the silver sockets of the foundation of the tabernacle. That's Torah, the study of Torah. Then comes Avodah, the service of God. The service of God, it refers to prayer. It refers to the sacrificial rites whose place prayer takes. You see, we pray 3 times a day in place of the sacrifices that took place in the temple every single day, 3 times. The morning sacrifice, the afternoon sacrifice, and the evening remnants of the daily sacrifices that were burnt all night, at least the beginning of the night. And so because we don't have a temple nowadays, and we don't have an altar, we don't bring sacrifices, in place of the sacrifices, we have prayer. Prayer is service of the heart. Prayer is spiritual working with ourselves to so-called offer ourselves to the Almighty in the spiritual sense to see how we can connect our heart and mind to the Almighty. And so their avoda, service of God, is represented by that second half shekel collection, which went for the communal sacrifices. What represents the third pillar? What represents the good deeds, the commandments, the mitzvot, the action aspect? That's the fundraising campaign of the materials, the 13 materials. Why is that? When we say the third pillar is kind deeds, that's a euphemism for the mitzvot, the commandments. The Talmud, and the Jerusalem Talmud actually says that what is a mitzvah, whenever the Talmud or the verse refers to a mitzvah without explaining which mitzvah it is referencing, it's referring to the mitzvah of giving charity. Because charity is the ultimate mitzvah in that one is giving from their heart and soul, their hard-earned money. They put their time, energy, sweat, something that they can use to buy their own livelihood, food that will become their source of life. And they go ahead and they give it to the needy. They go ahead and they give it to something greater than themselves. That is the ultimate mitzvah. And so when the verse tells us, Gemilut Chasadim, when it tells us good deeds, that's a euphemism for mitzvot, generally the mitzvah of charity, but including all of the commandments. Why is that represented by the collection of the 13 materials? Because just as mitzvot, what were they? What are they? They vary. There's something outside of ourselves. We do a mitzvah with the computer that we're using now. We're doing the mitzvah of study of Torah with a computer, something which is outside of us. We do the mitzvah with tefillin. Tefillin is what? Something tangible, something outside of ourselves, an object, a material. And it varies. There's mitzvah that we do with our heart. There's mitzvah that we do with various materials. There's mitzvah that we do with gold, with silver, with copper, with. So therefore, the collection of the 13 materials represent the mitzvot. All kinds of colorful and various categories of mitzvot. Text 6, in the words of the Rebbe. The first step to serving God is the pillar of Torah. Every facet of Judaism and the mitzvot have their source in the Torah, alluded to by the donations for the sockets, the foundation of the tabernacle. As for the half-shekel donations used to purchase communal offerings, they represent the pillar of service, namely the sacrificial services, and in the present day, the service of prayer. The donations of various materials used in the tabernacle's construction, gold, silver, and copper, etc., represent the performance of the various mitzvot, which are fulfilled with various physical materials, such as gold, etc., and which generally are embodied by deeds of kindness, for kind deeds are considered the embodiment of the mitzvot. So we have these three categories. We have the category of study of Torah, prayer, service of God, and the third one, action. And there's a clear difference between the first two and the third. What's the difference? The first two are internal. Study of Torah and prayer are internal. We study with our minds. It doesn't have to be for anyone outside of us. It's with our own mind. We're just studying Torah, utilizing an internal faculty. Prayer is the heart. We're utilizing our spiritual side to connect with the Almighty. Those are those two which are spiritual experiences. Then comes the action. Action specifically with materials that are outside of ourselves. They're out there in the daylight. Very different than the first two. We're going to explain those three at length. You see, Torah is something unique. Torah is the divine wisdom. When we study Torah, we achieve a remarkable union with God, a union with our mind and the divine mind. A union which is really unattainable in any other fashion. And we'll quote from the Tanya, foundational book of Chassidus, to explain this concept a little bit deeper. Text 7. When the mind conceives and comprehends a concept with its intellectual faculties, it grasps the concept and encompasses it so that the concept is contained within the mind. Right? Any topic that we're thinking about and we contemplate deeply upon it, we are right now grasping this concept and encompassing this concept in its entirety. It's contained within our mind. The mind, for its part, is also surrounded by the concept. For example, when a person understands a law in the Mishnah or Talmud fully and clearly, his mind encompasses it and grasps it, while simultaneously being encompassed by it. Now, halacha, law, is the wisdom and will of God. So when a person's mind masters it, he is grasping the will and wisdom of the Holy One, blessed be He, whom no thought can grasp, nor his will or wisdom, except when they are contained in the laws that have been set out for us. Simultaneously, his mind is encompassed by the divine will and wisdom. This is a wonderful union like which there is none other and without parallel anywhere in the material world, a union of complete oneness from every side and angle. There is nothing, no act as spiritual and as deep as Torah study, which is why we're encouraged, and it's actually a mitzvah, to study Torah at every free moment, at least a little bit in the morning and a little bit in the evening, day and night. And if we have more time, to study Torah more, because this is something that is really unattainable naturally, and it's only a gift that God has given us. Because we are becoming unified with the divine wisdom, and the divine is its wisdom. It's the deepest union that can possibly be, but it's spiritual. There's no action involved. Which brings us to the second spiritual experience, prayer, service of God. Prayer is also davening, as we say in Yiddish. I was in Argentina for a year, and they have some Yiddish words mixed in. I guess just like we have chutzpah and schlepping, they also have different words. But in the Jewish community, the words are actually very unique. I meet people on the street, would ask them to put on tefillin. They haven't put on tefillin. But one word they do know, davening. I say davening, they'd say, let's do davening in Spanish. Davening. Davening is deeper than just prayer, as we explained at length elsewhere. What's davening? Davening is a deep, personal, spiritual experience. Torah is an exercise of the mind. Prayer is an exercise of the heart. Davening. And here's from the Talmud. The verse states in Deuteronomy, to love the Lord your God and to serve him with all your might. Which is the service of God that is performed in the heart? It refers to prayer. See, when the verse talks about in Leviticus that we should bring a sacrifice to God, it says a person that will bring a sacrifice from you. Now, the grammar, even in the Hebrew, is confusing because it should have said in the Hebrew, a person from you, Adam mikem ki yakiv, a person from you who brings a sacrifice. And then it continues with the laws of the sacrifice. Why does it mix that around and say a person who brings a sacrifice from you? And so the Hasidic masters explain that it's a reference to the personal experience of the spiritual sacrifice, the sacrifice that we all give from ourselves, that a person who brings a sacrifice from you, in other words, from within ourselves. That's what prayer is about. It's to sacrifice ourselves, an aspect of ourselves, an aspect of our will, to connect, to bring it closer. As in the Hebrew word for sacrifice is karban, not only does it mean sacrifice, but it actually literally means to bring closer. That's the idea of davening, to bring ourselves closer to the Almighty. Again, a spiritual, deep spiritual experience. Which brings us to the third pillar. And that is the pillar of mitzvot, which is an exercise of the body, not a spiritual exercise. It's very different. As a matter of fact, it's not really spiritual at all. They don't take place in the mind. They don't take place in the heart. They can, ideally they should, but they don't have to. When we light Shabbos candles, it's an action. We're doing it with stuff, with materialism, with mundane objects. We put on tefillin, it's stuff. We make a blessing on an apple. We donate money to the poor. We put on straps of leather, the tefillin. We shake a palm branch. These are all actionable commandments that's with stuff, with things outside of ourselves, with materialism. That's what a mitzvah is. It's an exercise of the body. It's outside of ourselves. It's entirely different than the first two pillars. Torah study, text 9, Torah study and prayer both involves an experience that takes place within a person. By contrast, the third pillar, kind deeds, which includes all the mitzvot, is unique in that it doesn't take place within a person, but rather involves physical objects used in mitzvahs, so that something, even as it remains a physical object, can become as holy as the object of a mitzvah. And so now we have that the three funding campaigns are represent the three pillars on which the world stands. The funding campaign for the sockets, the foundation of the tabernacle, represents the foundation of all of Judaism, the Torah, which is a spiritual exercise. The funding campaign that was the half shekels for the communal sacrifices represents the second pillar of avodah, service of the heart, which is davening. And that as well is a spiritual experience. And then the third, which is the funding campaign for the materials. It wasn't a cash fundraising. It wasn't a crowdsourcing. It was, the lot of the synagogue is open. Bring all the materials that you possibly could to donate. Wood, copper, silver, gold. Bring everything that you can. That represented the third pillar. And as we shall soon see, the most important pillar, the action pillar. The one that is an exercise of the body, not a spiritual exercise. Now that we understand this idea, it'll bring us to circling back to the question of the Midrash. Why is the Midrash associating the building of the temple with the four kingdoms that exiled the Jewish people? You see, when we look at these three pillars and we analyze them and we say, which one is the most important, is the most central for Jewish life? Is it the spiritual experience of Torah or the spiritual experience of prayer? Or is it sometimes just run-of-the-mill, by rote fulfillment of the actionable commandments? Judaism tells us that the most important, and the Rebbe explains it at length, as we shall soon see, are the mitzvahs that take place outside of us and with physical objects. As Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, and we discussed this concept a number of times, the lower an object is, the lower something is, the more ungodly something seems, like straps of hide from an animal. When we take that and we transform them into something holy, that is the greatest fulfillment of the divine mission for which we were put here on this world. As a matter of fact, it's the greatest fulfillment. It is the fulfillment of the entire purpose of creation. In the words of the Alter Rebbe, text 10. We know from our sages that the purpose behind the creation of this world is God's desire for a home in the lowest realms. Thus, this tangibly physical world was created. It is the lowest realm. There is no place where God is so hidden and that it is so dark, full of klipot, the evil, the negative forces that literally oppose God, declaring I and nothing else exists. So the ultimate way to show the fulfillment of the divine mission. Why did God create this world? Because God wanted a place where he'd feel comfortable. In this lowest realm, if he wanted a place which only had Torah study and prayer, he would have left it by the angels. He would have left it by the spiritual realms. But he didn't want that. He wanted specifically a physical, tangible world with which we take those physical, tangible objects and transform them to a place where the divine is comfortable. Transform them to holy objects. That's what God wanted. That was the purpose of creation. And so how do we fulfill the purpose of creation? By Torah study, by prayer. But the greatest way we do it, the most important way, and most direct way that we fulfill that mission is by utilizing materialistic physical objects for holiness. And so the mandate that God gave us was, let's go to the darkest place on earth, utilize the darkest elements on earth, the places where the divine is the least visible, and demonstrate how they too were created by God and serve his will. And so when we walk into the study house, or the synagogue, and we pray, is that taking the lowest part? When the Jews during the times of the temple in Israel walked into the temple and watched the sacrifices, was that taking the lowest part of the world? It was taking a physical part. It was elevating the materialistic aspect of the world, but it wasn't the absolute lowest. What is the absolute lowest? The absolute lowest is when we're in exile. When we are in exile, in the lowest time, in the time when there's no temple visible to us, in the time when there's no divine miracles occurring that we can readily see, as they did in the temple. In that time, we go ahead and we fulfill the commandments, and we do those 13 materials which represents fulfilling of the physical commandments. That is the greatest expression of this concept of bringing the divine to those darkest places. And I just want to clarify something important that we've discussed at length elsewhere, that obviously this means the darkest places permissible within the framework of Jewish law. So we can't say that I'm going to eat a good ham sandwich and I'm going to make a blessing and use that energy that I got from eating the ham sandwich, and I'm going to go ahead and do Haggadah. Now I'm strong enough to do Haggadah. Look, I'm elevating it, I'm revealing the divine in that. Obviously not. When God says something is prohibited, that's because we cannot utilize that. We cannot bring the divine there. And by us doing something like that, not only aren't we performing a mitzvah, it's the contrary. But within the framework of Jewish law, within the area that we are able to, we have to go to the farthest and the deepest point possible. This idea that what's greatest, what's most central in Judaism is the actionable part, isn't something that was only discussed recently, but it's actually in the Talmud. And the Talmud tells us an interesting episode. There was an incident in which Rabbi Tarfon and the elders, Rabbi Tarfon was a contemporary of Rabbi Akiva, as we shall see, and the elders were reclining in the loft of the house of Nitza in Lod, in Israel, when this question was asked of them: is Torah study greater, or is action, performing mitzvot, greater? Rabbi Tarfon answered and said, action is greater. Rabbi Akiva answered and said, Torah study is greater. Everyone, that means including Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva, answered and said, Torah study is greater because Torah study leads to action. In other words, what the sages explain is that Torah study is an excellent path to self-improvement, to spirituality, to personal spirituality. But the ultimate reason why Torah study is so great, the ultimate reason why it's so important, is because it leads a person down the path to mitzvah observance, to performing those practical mitzvahs. In other words, essentially what we're saying is Torah study, prayer are important. They're valuable to the extent that they lead to action, which is our ability to transform the lowest parts of this world. This explains why in this week's Torah portion, when we're discussing the building of the Mishkan, if you remember in the first text that we read, the verses from the opening verses of the Torah portion, we read about these 3 funding campaigns. But I mentioned that only one is explained explicitly and at length in this week's Torah portion, and that is the funding campaign of the materials needed for the tabernacle. Why? Why is that the most explained and elucidated in this week's Torah portion? Because this exact reason is precisely that which is most important. The action is what's most important. The only one of the three collections mentioned explicitly in the parsha is a collection of materials for the tabernacle's construction, which represents the mitzvot, because that's the most important thing. The other collections, which represent Torah study and prayer, are alluded in passing only, because at their core, they are simply the groundwork that makes the construction and function of God's home possible. The contribution of gold and silver, the all-transforming mitzvahs, as explained, as we just explained, is not only important for those days, is not only important for the times of the temple, but it's important nowadays also. And that's why the Midrash explains that the first four materials representing the fulfillment of the commandments correspond to the four exiles. Precisely this reason, as we explained earlier, because that is what makes this world a dwelling place for God, by going to those places and to those eras, now in exile, when we don't have a temple, when we don't see the miraculous happenings in the temple. And we still go ahead and bring those materials. In other words, we go ahead and we fulfill those materialistic commandments. That is the ultimate dwelling place for God, the ultimate way of drawing down the divine into this physical world, fulfilling our mandate to make this world a dwelling place for the Almighty. The words of the Rebbe. This explains the idea in the Midrash that the gold and silver, etc., of the tabernacle correspond to the four kingdoms. The purpose of the donated materials was to build a home for God in this world. This is most fully accomplished, not so much by building the physical tabernacle, a place of overt spirituality, but by our efforts during the exile. An era gripped by the physical trappings of the world, by our efforts to transform this degree of brute materialism to holiness, we uplift the most crass elements of the physical reality. And this works just like the idea of the spiritual experiences of Torah and prayer versus the nitty-gritty mitzvot. Spiritually speaking, Torah and prayer seem to be the most spiritual. They're great, they're lofty. They make for a much greater spiritual experience. But ultimately, it's not about the experience. It's about getting the job done. It's about the goal. And the goal in mind is to make this world, the physicality, the materialism of the world, a dwelling place for the Almighty. So Torah and prayer, the great spiritual experiences that they do give us, is only useful to the degree that it advances our actionable mission, the fulfillment of the mitzvah. So this idea, understanding this concept, is the idea that the study of Torah is very important. It's essential. It's great. Davening is essential. But we can't stop at that, because they're essential only as much as they lead us to the action, because action is most important. Brings to mind an interesting anecdote from an era bygone. They say the story that a miser, a rich man, once had a knock on his door, and there was a poor man standing there. And with his last strengths, he turns to the miser and he says, "Please, I need something to eat. I'm starving." Miser says, "What are you coming to me for? Go to the synagogue. They have food there. They fundraise for this thing for people. No, don't come to me." He says, "Please, I'm not going to make it to the synagogue. Please just help me with anything." So the miser turns around, he sees the garbage dump, he schleps out some smelly, rotten piece of fish, and he throws it at the poor guy. The poor guy takes it, he gobbles it up in an instant. And by the time he makes it down the stairs of this rich man's mansion, he collapses. Some passersby see what happened. They quickly take him. They take him to the hospital, to the clinic, to whatever they had at that time. And back in the miser's home, it comes time for the evening prayer, and he goes to the synagogue. He comes back home from the synagogue, and he tells his wife, "I'm sorry. Look, I'm gonna have to go straight to the hospital because That poor man who was here earlier today, he collapsed apparently, and he got very, very sick. So I have to go fulfill the commandment of visiting the sick. And he goes and he goes and he visits the sick. The next day he goes to synagogue in the morning. He comes home and he tells his wife, "Look, I'm going to be late because I got to go because the poor man who passed away, the poor man who got sick has passed away from his illness. And so I have to go fulfill the commandments of escorting the deceased. It's a great commandment." And he goes and he escorts the deceased. He comes home and tells his wife, "Look, I got to go tonight. It's very, very important because I found out that the deceased has a loved one. He has a son who's sitting Shiva, and I have to go pay a Shiva call. There's a great mitzvah known as the Shiva call. I have to go pay my respects." He comes home and he's beaming with joy. He's all excited. And his wife turns to him and says, "What are you so excited about? What are you so happy about? What's so exciting about visiting an orphan who's sitting Shiva about the untimely passing of his father? What's so exciting?" And so the man turns to his wife and he says, "How can I not be overjoyed when I think about how many tremendous mitzvahs I performed with one smelly, stinky piece of fish?" Think about it. With this one smelly piece of fish, I achieved 4 of the greatest mitzvahs. I achieved the mitzvah of hospitality to the poor, of visiting the sick, of escorting the deceased, of going to a Shiva house. What's the point of this story? The point of the story is that the guy missed the point. Missed the point because the most important are the practical commandments, not the ones that we deem more practical and more important and less important, but the practical commandments as they come to us. At the time for putting on tefillin, the most important is to put on tefillin. At the time of giving charity, the point of the mitzvah is to give charity in the best way possible. The fulfillment of the mitzvahs is what's most important. And as we mentioned earlier, the mitzvahs are generally referred to as gmilut chasadim, being kind deeds. And there's a powerful Hayom Yom being a compilation that the Rebbe made in 1941, the calendar year of 43 and 44, 1942, 43, 44, of various sayings of the previous Rebbe. And there's a powerful quote from the Baal Shem Tov, which expresses this idea beautifully. The Alter Rebbe received the following teaching from the Tzaddik Reb Mordechai, who had heard it from the Baal Shem Tov. A soul may descend to this world and live 70 or 80 years in order to do a Jew a spiritual favor, and certainly a spiritual one. So what's the lesson? The lesson we have is that yes, we must study. We got to study Torah because that's the foundation. And we have to daven because that's who we are, and that's a mitzvah in the Torah. We have to have the service of our heart. But those two are only as great as it leads us to the transformational actions of the mitzvahs, because those are of paramount importance. And by fulfilling the mitzvahs, we thereby are building the spiritual temple of those actionable materials of gold, copper, silver, specifically in a time of exile. And that will hasten the building of the temple, the actual temple, with the coming of Mashiach.